It was just a family portrait, until historians discovered the truth about the child. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society in a worn leather portfolio donated by the estate of Elizabeth Hartwell, a retired schoolteacher from Boston, who had passed away at 93. Among dozens of family documents, this particular image stood out. It was a formal portrait from 1889. Sepia-toned and remarkably well preserved, showing a wealthy family posed in their grand parlor. Dr. Rachel Montgomery, a historian specializing in post-Civil War America, carefully lifted the photograph from its protective sleeve. The image showed a prosperous family. A stern-faced father in a dark suit, with a watch chain gleaming across his vest. A mother in an elaborate dress with leg of mutton sleeves, and two older children, a teenage boy and girl, standing rigidly beside their parents. The room behind them spoke of wealth. Ornate wallpaper, heavy draperies, and expensive furniture gleamed in the photographer's flash powder light. Rachel had examined hundreds of portraits from this era, but something about this one caught her attention. In the background, slightly out of focus, two small figures sat on an expensive Persian rug. She leaned closer, squinting at the details. Two girls, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, appeared to be playing with wooden toys. One wore her blonde hair in elaborate ringlets. The other had dark, tightly coiled hair. Interesting, Rachel murmured, reaching for her magnifying glass. Two children playing in the background during a formal portrait, unusual. Her colleague, James Chen, looked up from a stack of documents. What have you got? A family portrait. Late 1880. Maybe 1890. But there are children in the background who aren't part of the formal composition. James walked over, adjusting his glasses. The photographer probably didn't have time to remove them before taking the shot. Film was expensive back then. They might not have wanted to waste another plate. Rachel nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the two small figures. Both girls wore identical dresses, expensive-looking garments with lace collars and ribbon details. It was remarkable. In an era when class distinctions were marked clearly by clothing, seeing two children dressed so similarly was noteworthy, especially considering one child was white and the other black. Look at these dresses, Rachel said, pointing. They're identical. Same fabric, same lace trim, same ribbons. In 1889. That's extraordinary. Wealthy families did not typically dress black children, servants or otherwise, in clothing that matched their own children. Maybe she was adopted or a ward of the family, James suggested. Maybe, Rachel said, though doubt colored her voice. Formal adoption of black children by wealthy white families was virtually unheard of in this era, and wards were usually kept at a distance, not dressed identically to biological children. She continued examining the photograph, noting every detail. The blonde girl held a wooden horse, her face bright, with a genuine smile. The black girl reached toward building blocks scattered on the rug, her expression harder to read in the slightly blurred background. I'm going to scan this at high resolution, Rachel said, carrying the photograph toward the society's imaging equipment. There's something about those children in the background, something worth examining more closely. 3 days later, Rachel sat in her cramped office. The high-resolution scan of the 1889 portrait displayed across 2 monitors. She had been examining every inch of the image, documenting details for the Society's archive. The formal subjects identified through the portfolio's documentation as the Richmond family of Boston had been thoroughly catalogued. Jonathan Richmond, a shipping magnate, his wife Caroline, and their children Thomas and Catherine, but the 2 girls in the background had no names attached. Rachel zoomed in on the children, enhancing the image with careful adjustments to contrast and sharpness. The blonde girl, clearly a Richmond daughter, smiled as she held a wooden horse. The other child, the black girl, reached toward a collection of building blocks scattered on the rug. Then Rachel saw it. Her hand froze on the mouse. She leaned forward, her face inches from the screen, and zoomed in further on the black child's hands. There, barely visible in the enhanced image, were marks not the casual scrapes and bruises of childhood play, but something else entirely. Circular impressions around the wrists, dark bands of discoloration forming perfect rings, as if something had been wrapped tightly around the small wrists for extended periods. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed out slightly, then moved to the child's legs. Where the dress had shifted during play, one ankle was visible. The same marks, circular impressions darker than the surrounding skin, suggested repeated restraint. Rachel had seen marks like these before. In photographs of formerly enslaved people, in medical documentation from the era, and in haunting images circulated by abolitionist societies to expose the horrors of bondage. These were restraint marks left by shackles or chains worn over time. But that was impossible. Slavery had been abolished in 1865. The 13th Amendment had made it illegal throughout the United States. This photograph was dated 1889, 24 years after emancipation. No child in Boston, in a wealthy household, could possibly be enslaved in 1889, unless... Rachel's mind raced through possibilities. Whispered accounts she'd heard in graduate school, stories of clandestine servitude that continued long after the Civil War. Children held in conditions that were slavery in everything but name, invisible to census takers and authorities. She grabbed her phone and called James. "I need you to come to my office right now." "What's wrong? You sound..." The Richmond portrait. The child in the background. "James? I think we found something terrible." Within 20 minutes, James stood beside her desk, staring at the enhanced images. His face had gone pale. "Those are restraint marks," he said quietly. "Rachel, those are definitely restraint marks." "I know. But that's impossible. This is Boston. 1889. 24 years after." "I know," James said. "But look at them. Tell me what else they could be." He couldn't. Neither could Rachel. The evidence was undeniable, horrifying, and demanded investigation. Within an hour, 3 members of the Historical Society's research team crowded into Rachel's office. The marks on the child's wrists and ankle were unmistakable once you knew to look for them. Circular impressions that spoke of metal cuffs, of restraint, of bondage that should have been impossible in post-Civil War Massachusetts. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Society's director, removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She had spent her entire career studying American history. But the image before her challenged everything she thought she knew about the post-emancipation North. "Are we absolutely certain these aren't shadows? Image artifacts?" Rachel shook her head. "I've checked multiple times with different enhancement techniques. I consulted a forensic photographer. These marks are consistent with prolonged restraint. And look here." She zoomed in on the child's neck, partially visible above her lace collar. Bruising. Faint, but present. James leaned back, his expression grave. "If this is what we think it is, we're seeing evidence of illegal slavery continuing in Boston, nearly a quarter century after the 13th Amendment, in one of the wealthiest households in the city. We need to identify this child," Patricia said firmly. "And we need to understand what was happening in the Richmond household. This is evidence of a crime, an injustice." Over the next week, Rachel immersed herself in research. The Richmond family had been prominent in Boston society. Jonathan Richmond's shipping company had made him a fortune in the decades after the Civil War. They attended galas, hosted lavish parties, and donated to charities. They appeared to be pillars of the community, but public records revealed little about the family's private life and nothing about the black child in the photograph. Rachel began with census records. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed in a fire, creating a frustrating gap, but she found the Richmond household in the 1880 census. Jonathan and Caroline Richmond, and their 3 children, Thomas, born 1872, Catherine, born 1875, and Margaret, born 1882. 3 children. The census listed 3, matching the photograph. The 2 teenagers and the blonde girl in the background. The black child was not listed. Margaret Richmond was 7 years old in 1889. But there was no record of any other child in the household. No servants listed. No extended family. No wards or adopted children. According to official documents, the black child in the photograph didn't exist at all. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the census notation glowing on the screen. The child was invisible present in the photograph, yet absent from every record that should have documented her existence. "Who are you?" she whispered to the image on her screen. "And what happened to you in that house?" Her search took her deep into Boston's historical archives. If the child wasn't listed in the census, perhaps she appeared elsewhere. Employment logs, household accounts, church records, school enrollments. But every search came up empty, as if the child had never lived in Boston at all, except for the single frozen moment preserved in the Richmond portrait. Then Rachel found something unexpected in the Massachusetts State Archives. A private letter collection from a woman named Helen Bradford, a contemporary of Caroline Richmond. The letters, barely catalogued, sat undisturbed in acid-free boxes. Most contained gossip, notes on fashion, and complaints about household staff. But then Rachel found the letter dated March 1888. "Caroline Richmond continues to host the most elegant afternoon teas," Helen wrote to her sister. "Though I must say, her household management seems peculiar. She has that little colored girl always about, dressed as fine as her own Margaret, and the 2 inseparable as twins. Little Margaret adores her, calls her her dearest friend. Some whisper about the arrangement, but Caroline insists the child is an orphan she's taken in as a charitable gesture. Still, I've never seen a charity case dressed in imported French lace and silk ribbons. The girl never speaks at gatherings, just stands near Margaret like a shadow. There's something unsettling about it." Rachel's hands trembled as she photographed the letter. This confirmed the child's existence and her strange status in the household. The identical clothing wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. But Charity did not explain the restraint marks on her wrists and ankles. Charitable wards weren't chained. Rachel continued through the correspondence. Helen Bradford had been unusually observant. Another letter, dated June 1889. "I attended Caroline's garden party yesterday. Little Margaret and that colored girl were playing together on the lawn, and I noticed the colored child wore long sleeves, despite the heat. When I mentioned it to Caroline, she became quite sharp, saying the child had sensitive skin. But Martha Aldrich told me later she'd seen bruises on the child's arms when her sleeves rode up. What kind of charity is this?" And then a letter from November 1889, months after the portrait was taken. "The Richmond household is shrouded in whispers. That little colored girl has vanished. Caroline claims she's been sent to relatives in the South. But Mary Blackwood swears she heard terrible crying from the upper floors late one night, and when she asked the staff about it the next day, they wouldn't meet her eyes. The staff have been sworn to some kind of secrecy. Jonathan Richmond has become tyrannical about privacy, refusing all visitors. Margaret is devastated. She cries constantly for her lost friend. The child had disappeared. Vanished, with no explanation beyond a flimsy story about Southern relatives." Rachel scribbled notes furiously. The timeline became painfully clear. The photograph captured 2 girls dressed identically, playing together. Then, within months, the black child was gone. The marks on her body hinted at prolonged restraint. But why? And what final fate had she met? Rachel's breakthrough came from an unlikely source. While reviewing Jonathan Richmond's business operations, she discovered that his shipping company had kept meticulous records, detailed manifests, documenting every voyage. These records had been donated long ago to the Maritime Museum in Salem. On a cold February morning, Rachel drove north. Snow dusted the highway as she made her way toward the harbor. The Maritime Museum occupied a converted warehouse, and the archivist, Peter Donnelly, greeted her warmly. "The Richmond Shipping Company records," he said as he led her to shelves lined with labeled boxes. Richmond documented everything. Most shipping companies barely kept notes. But he was thorough, some might say obsessive. "What are you looking for specifically?" he asked. "Passenger manifests from the late 1880, Rachel said. "Especially voyages to and from Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans." Peter produced several carefully labeled boxes. "Here 1887, 1888, and 1889. Rachel donned cotton gloves and began reading through the manifests. Voyage after voyage, each written in precise handwriting. Most passengers were businessmen, families relocating, or immigrants traveling southward. Then, in a manifest dated the 12th of July, 1887, she found it. SS Marianne, Charleston to Boston. Cargo, cotton, tobacco, naval stores, passengers. Mr. Jonathan Richmond. Returning. Mr. Charles Whitmore, merchant part. Mrs. Adelaide Foster and 2 children, relocating. Also transported, child, Negro female, approximately 5 years of age, traveling in care of Mr. Jonathan Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as domestic servant. Rachel's hands shook. A 5-year-old child transported from Charleston to Boston as a domestic servant. No name. Just a description. Cold. Clinical. Horrifying. She searched the manifests from later years with growing urgency. Month after month until she found the second entry. SS Marianne, Boston to Charleston. The 23rd of August 1889. Cargo. Textiles. Machinery. Passengers. Mrs. Caroline Richmond. Business travel. Mr. Thomas Blackwood, merchant, also transported. Child, Negro female, approximately 7 years of age, traveling in care of Mrs. Caroline Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as returning to family. The dates lined up perfectly. The child had been brought north in 1887 at age 5. Photographed in 1889, at age 7. Sent south again months later, after the portrait, after the bruises, after the whispers. Returning to family, Rachel whispered bitterly. Nothing in the letters suggested any family in the South. The explanation read like a lie. A bureaucratic cover for something far darker. Rachel shifted her focus to Charleston. Someone there might have records, or at least oral histories, of children taken north under false pretenses. She contacted Dr. Marcus Freeman, a historian at the College of Charleston. When she told him everything, the photograph, the marks, the shipping manifests, his response was immediate and grave. "What you're describing sounds like clandestine servitude," Marcus said through the video call. His voice carried both scholarly weight and personal sorrow. After the Civil War, cases like this were more common than people want to admit. Wealthy families continued to hold black children in bondage, disguised as apprenticeships, wardship, or charity. But the reality was slavery by another name. But how could this happen in Boston? Rachel asked. 24 years after emancipation, in a northern city known for abolition? Marcus gave a weary, knowing sigh. Because these children had no legal documentation, he said. No birth certificates, no parents who could advocate for them, no social standing. They could be taken, moved, passed from one household to another, and no institution would question it. In the chaos of Reconstruction, thousands of black children were left essentially orphaned. Their parents were dead, displaced, or too poor to care for them. Families were told their children would have opportunities in the North: education, good food, safety. But once transported, these children had no way to prove their free status, no way to contact their families, and no way to leave. They became invisible in official records, missing from census data, absent from school rosters, existing in a legal gray zone that made exploitation easy and consequences unlikely. Marcus promised to search Charleston archives for any records connected to the Richmond family or missing children from 1887. 3 days later, he called Rachel, his voice tight with emotion. He had found something. In the Charleston Police Department's July 1887 records, a black family named Wallace had reported their 5-year-old daughter missing. The report was filed on July 9th, just 3 days before the shipping manifest that listed a 5-year-old black girl transported by Richmond from Charleston to Boston. The timing was too precise to ignore. Her name was Sarah Wallace. According to the report, she had last been seen near the docks early in the morning. The family insisted she had been taken, that a well-dressed white man had approached them, offering promises of work and education in the North. Her mother, Claire Wallace, refused. But the next morning, Sarah was gone. The detective's notes were infuriating. He had dismissed the complaint, claiming the child probably wandered off or that the family was causing trouble. The case was closed within a week. After weeks of research, the child in the photograph finally had a name. She wasn't just an unnamed victim or a forgotten statistic. She was Sarah Wallace, taken from her family at 5 years old. Rachel leaned toward her computer screen. Were there descendants? Anyone, still in Charleston, who might know family stories? Marcus hesitated. He had found the parents' death certificates. Clara died in 1892, just 3 years after Sarah would have returned if she ever had. Samuel, the father, died in 1896. But Clara's obituary held one more clue. She was survived by a son, Samuel Wallace, named after his father. Marcus was still tracing his line. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood on the doorstep of a modest Charleston home, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The small house was neat, with flower boxes under the windows and blue-painted shutters. Dr. Marcus Freeman stood beside her. Grace Robinson answered the door, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her arthritic hands were twisted with age, but her eyes were sharp. At 87, she was the great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Wallace, Sarah's older brother. "You found something about my family," Grace said, ushering them inside. "Something about a child who was taken." Rachel sat on the edge of a floral sofa, unsure how to begin. How do you tell someone you found proof of their ancestors' suffering? How do you give someone a name and a face, but no certainty of a happy ending? "My grandmother told me the stories," Grace said softly. Her voice carried the weight of generations, mothers telling daughters about the sister who vanished. The family had never stopped looking for Sarah, never stopped grieving. Samuel, Grace's great-grandfather, had spent years searching for her. He never forgot her. Grace brought out a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside were photographs, letters, and Samuel Wallace's journal, passed down as a sacred family trust. Rachel's hands trembled as she opened the weathered diary. The handwriting inside was careful but uneven, the script of someone who had taught himself to read and write. July 15th, 1887. Sarah is gone. Mama says a white man in fine clothes took her near the docks. He told them he would give her work, up north. Give her a better life. Schooling. Said she would send money back. Papa tried to fight. Said she was too young, but the man laughed. Said we should be grateful. Police won't listen. They say she wandered off. That we're making trouble. August 3rd, 1887. Still no word. Mama cries every night. She sleeps in Sarah's bed, holding her doll. I pray she's safe. Papa says the man's eyes were cold. And to set her, telv, banama. Telver for ma. And degrided, imonanum. December 25th, 1887. Christmas without Sarah. Mama made her favorite cake, but none of us could eat it. We saved a piece for her. Does she remember us? Does she know we're looking for her? The entries continued. Year after year, Samuel's grief preserved in ink. Then, in September 1889, everything changed. A letter arrived with no return address. Only a Boston postmark. Inside was a photograph. When Samuel's mother saw it, she screamed. It was Sarah, alive, dressed like a wealthy white child, playing beside a white girl in matching clothes. But her eyes, her mother insisted something was wrong. Sarah looked frightened. Despite the toys and finery, they tried to trace the photo, but there was no way. Who sent it? Was it Sarah herself? Was it someone trying to help? Why send a photo, but not send her home? Rachel whispered to Grace. Someone in the Richmond household must have sent it. Grace nodded, tears falling. Samuel had kept that photograph until the day he died, staring at it for hours, trying to understand whether his sister had been safe or in silent terror. Back in Boston, Rachel followed a new lead. If someone in the Richmond household had sent the photograph, maybe a servant, had witnessed what happened to Sarah. Employment records from 1889 listed 5 staff members in the Richmond home. Most trails were dead ends, but one remained. Mary O'Brien, a young Irish maid whose descendants still lived in the Boston area. Her great-grandson, Thomas O'Brien, agreed to meet with Rachel. He brought out a box of family papers letters Mary had written to her sister Bridget in Ireland. In a letter from May 1889, Mary wrote, "Dear Bridget, there's wickedness in this house, though it hides behind fine manners and charity. They keep that poor colored child locked in the nursery at night. I've seen the chains on her bed frame, heard them rattle in the mornings. Mrs. Richmond says, it's for the child's own good, but I know cruelty when I see it. The child cries for her mama at night. Little Margaret, the youngest Richmond daughter, begs them to let Sarah sleep in her room instead. She says Sarah is frightened alone, but Mr. Richmond refuses. He insists it is important Sarah learn her place. What place? She is a child, no different from Margaret except for the color of her skin." Rachel's eyes burned with tears as she read the letter. Mary O'Brien had known Sarah's name. She had heard the child crying at night. She had witnessed everything. Another letter, dated July 1889, revealed even more. The colored child is being sent away. They say she's going back to her family in the South, but I do not believe it. I helped pack her trunk, and there was nothing in it but rags, old worn clothes, not the fine dresses she wears when company comes. Where are those dresses? Why send her home in rags if she is truly returning to family? When I asked Mrs. Richmond, she told me to mind my business or find work elsewhere. Something terrible is happening here. With Mary O'Brien's testimony and the Wallace family records, Rachel finally assembled the pieces of Sarah Wallace's story. She presented it to the Massachusetts Historical Society in a packed conference room. Board members, journalists, and descendants of both the Richmond and Wallace families sat waiting. The weight of what she was about to reveal hung heavily in the air. Rachel began calmly despite the emotion tightening her voice. In July 1887, Jonathan Richmond traveled to Charleston on business. While there, he encountered the Wallace family near the docks where they lived and worked. He offered to take their 5-year-old daughter Sarah north to Boston. He promised education, employment, and a better life promises families in the post-Reconstruction South heard often, and sometimes desperately believed. She clicked the projector to the next slide, showing the shipping manifest. But Sarah hadn't been taken for charity. The Richmond's youngest daughter, Margaret, also 5 years old, needed a companion, a playmate, someone always beside her, someone she could grow up with. The Richmonds could have hired a nursemaid or a governess, but they wanted something different. They wanted a child who would be completely dependent on them, completely under their control. The enhanced image of Sarah's wrists filled the screen, the restraint marks clearly visible. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Sarah was dressed in expensive clothing when company visited, creating the illusion of benevolence. The matching dresses she and Margaret wore suggested equality, perhaps even friendship, and Margaret genuinely did care for her. The letters made that clear. But when night fell, Sarah was chained to her bed to prevent escape. She was beaten for disobedience. She was told her family had abandoned her, that she had nowhere else to go. Rachel's voice hardened. This was slavery in everything but name. Sarah had no legal documentation, no proof she was free, no way to leave, no way to contact her family, no way to appeal for help. She existed outside the official record, visible only to those who exploited her or those who witnessed her suffering without power to stop it. Patricia Williams, the Historical Society's director, stood. Her face was pale, but steady. Dr. Montgomery, what happened to Sarah after she was returned to Charleston in August 1889? Rachel braced herself. This was the question she feared most. We don't know. The shipping manifest confirms she was transported south, supposedly returning to her family. But no evidence exists that she ever reached the Wallace home. Samuel Wallace's journal never mentions her return. There is no death certificate, no burial record, no marriage listing, no census entry. After August 1889, Sarah Wallace disappears from the historical record. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. It's possible, Rachel continued carefully, that she was sold or sent to another household in the South. Children held in clandestine servitude were often moved frequently so they couldn't form connections or find help. It's also possible she did not survive the journey or died soon after arrival. The conditions for black passengers, especially children, were often brutal. Grace Robinson, seated in the front row, spoke with a trembling voice. But we know she existed. We know her name. We know she suffered. That is more than we had before. My family has searched for Sarah for over a century. Now we finally have proof. We finally know she was real, and loved, and missed. 6 months after Rachel's discovery, the Massachusetts Historical Society opened a groundbreaking exhibition. Invisible Children, Clandestine Servitude in Post-Civil War America. The exhibition hall was transformed. Walls were lined with photographs, documents, journals, and testimony telling the stories of children like Sarah, black children held in bondage long after slavery's end, hidden behind the respectability of wealthy households. At the center hung the infamous 1889 Richmond family portrait. But the display was designed to shift all attention to the children in the background. Sarah's face had been enlarged and enhanced, illuminated so no one could ignore it. A placard beside it told Sarah's story, her abduction, her years of captivity, the restraint marks, the mysterious disappearance that followed. Grace Robinson attended the opening, accompanied by 15 members of the Wallace family. She was now 88. Moving slowly but determinedly, she stood before the portrait with tears streaming down her face. Seeing her great-great-aunt clearly, for the first time, no longer a half-remembered story, but a child frozen in time. She was beautiful, Grace whispered, resting her trembling fingers against the glass. Look at her face. Even with everything they did to her, she was still a child. Still playing. Still hoping. She was brave. Braver than any of us will ever understand. The exhibition sparked a wave of national research. Historians across the country began examining family photographs from the 1870 to the 1890 with new eyes. They discovered dozens of children like Sarah within months, then hundreds. Each photograph revealed another stolen child, another life trapped in hidden servitude long after slavery's abolition. Newspapers ran front-page stories. The Boston Globe published Hidden Slavery, exposing how wealthy families continued enslaving children for decades after the Civil War. More Wallace relatives reached out, sharing oral histories of children who disappeared and were never found. Universities launched research initiatives. Genealogists volunteered their time, The National Archives committed to digitizing documents that could uncover more cases. Rachel watched visitors circulate through the exhibition. Many stopped at Sarah's enlarged face and read her story in silence. Some cried. Some clenched their fists. All left transformed. A young black woman approached Rachel, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for making them visible. For giving them names. My family has stories like this too, children who never came home." Seeing Sarah's face, knowing someone cared enough to search and speak the truth, it matters. It matters so much. A portrait that had once seemed harmless, a wealthy family posing formally while two children played in the background, had exposed a truth long buried. Sarah Wallace would never be forgotten again. Her face, her name, her suffering, her courage, and somewhere in archives and attics across America, other faces waited to be found. Other stolen children dressed in fine clothes to disguise their captivity. Other restraint marks hidden at the edges of photographs. Other lives waiting to be named. The work of remembering had only just begun.